Chapter 22 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 22. Doctor and Devil. Pat rushed to the door, out upon the porch, and down to the street. Dr. Horker followed her to the entrance and stood watching her as she darted toward the dejected figure beside the car. "Nick!" she cried. "I'm here, honey! You heard me, didn't you?" She flung herself into his arms. He held her eagerly, pressing a hasty, tender kiss on her lips. "You heard me," she murmured. "Yes." His voice was husky, strained. "What is it, Pat? Tell me quickly. God knows how much time we have." "It's Dr. Carl. He'll help us, Nick." "Help us? No one can help us, dear. No one." "He'll try. It can't do any harm, honey. Come in with me, now." "It's useless, I tell you." "But come," she pleaded. "Come anyway." "Pat, I tell you this battle has to be fought out by me alone. I'm the only one who can do anything at all, and—" He lowered his voice. "Pat, I'm losing." "Nick!" "That's why I came tonight. I was too cowardly to make our last meeting, Monday evening in the park, a definite farewell. I wanted to, but I weakened. So tonight, Pat, it's a final goodbye, and you thank heaven for it." "Oh, Nick, dear." "It was touch and go whether I came at all tonight. It was a struggle, Pat. He is as strong as I am now. Or stronger." The girl gazed searchingly into his worn, weary face. He looked miserably ill, she thought. He seemed as exhausted as one who had been engaged in a physical battle. "Nick," she said insistently, "I don't care what you say. You're coming in with me. Only for a little while." She tugged at his hand, dragging him reluctantly after her. He followed her to the porch where the open door still framed the great figure of the doctor. "You know Dr. Carl," she said. "Come inside," growled Horker. Pat noticed the gruffness of his voice, his lack of any cordiality, but she said nothing as she pulled her reluctant companion through the door and into the library. The doctor drew up another chair, and Pat, more accustomed to his devices, observed that he placed it in such position that the lamp cast a stream of radiance on Nick's face. She sank into her own chair and waited silently for developments. "Well," said Horker, turning his shrewd old eyes on Nick's countenance. "Let's get down to cases. Pat told me what she knows. We can take that much for granted. Is there anything more you might want to tell?" "No, sir," responded the youth wearily. "I've told Pat all I know." "Humph. Maybe I can ask some leading questions then. Will you answer them?" "Of course. Any that I can." "All right. Now." The doctor's voice took on a cool professional edge. "You've had these, attacks as long as you can remember. Is that right?" "Yes." "But they've been more severe of late." "Much worse, sir." "Since when?" "Since about as long as I've known Pat. 4 or 5 weeks." "Mm-hmm," droned the doctor. "You've no idea of the cause for this increase in the malignancy of the attacks?" "No, sir," said Nick, after a barely perceptible hesitation. "You don't think the cause could be in any way connected with, let us say, the emotional disturbances attending your acquaintance with Pat here?" "No, sir," said the youth flatly. "All right," said Horker. "Let that angle go for the present. Are there any after effects for these spells?" "Yes. There's always a splitting headache." He closed his eyes. "I have one of them now." "Localized?" "Sir?" "Is the pain in any particular region? Forehead, temples, eyes, or so forth?" "No. Just a nasty headache." "But no other after effects?" "I can't think of any others. Except perhaps a feeling of exhaustion after I've gone through what I've just finished." He closed his eyes as if to shut out the recollection. "Well," mused the doctor, We'll forget the physical symptoms. What happens to your individuality, your own consciousness, while you're suffering an attack? Nothing happens to it, said Nick with a suppressed shudder. I watch and hear, but what he does is beyond my control. It's terrifying. Horrible, he burst out suddenly. Doubtless, responded Horker smoothly. What about the other? Does that one stand by while you're in the saddle? I don't know, muttered Nick dully. Of course he does, he added abruptly. I can feel his presence at all times. Even now. He's always lurking, waiting to spring forth as soon as I relax. Humph, ejaculated the doctor. How do you manage to sleep? By waiting for exhaustion, said Nick wearily. By waiting until I can stay awake no longer. And can you bring this other personality into dominance? Can you change controls, so to speak, at will? Why, yes, the youth answered, hesitating as if puzzled. Yes, I suppose I could. Let's see you then. But horror was in his voice. No, Dr. Carl, Pat interjected in fright. I won't let him. I thought you declared yourself out of this, said Horker with a shrewd glance at the girl. Then I'm back in. I won't let him do what you want. Anyway, not that. Pat, said the doctor with an air of patience, you want me to treat this affliction, don't you? Isn't that what both of you want? The girl murmured a scarcely audible assent. Very well, then, he proceeded. Do you expect me to treat the thing blindly, in the dark? Do you think I can guess at the cause without observing the effect? No, said Pat faintly. So, now then. He turned to Nick. Let's see the transformation. Must I? Asked the youth reluctantly. If you want my help. All right, he agreed with another tremor. He sat passively staring at the doctor. A moment passed. Horker heard Pat's nervous breathing. Other than that, the room was silent. Nicholas Devine closed his eyes, brushed his hand across his forehead. A moment more and he opened them to gaze perplexedly at the doctor. He won't, he muttered in astonishment. He won't do it. Humph, snapped the doctor, ignoring Pat's murmur of relief. Finicky devil, isn't he? Likes to pick company he can bully. I don't understand it. Nick's face was blank. He's been tormenting me until just now. He looked at the doctor. You don't think I'm lying about it, do you, Dr. Horker? Not consciously, replied the other coolly. If I thought you were responsible for a few of the indignities perpetrated on Pat here, I'd waste no time in questions, young man. I'd be relieving myself of certain violent impulses instead. I couldn't harm Pat. You gave a passable imitation of it then. However, that's besides the point. As I say, I don't hold you responsible for aberrations which I believe are beyond your control. The main thing is a diagnosis. Do you know what it is? Cut in Pat eagerly. Not yet. At least, not for certain. There's only one real method available. These questions will get us nowhere. We'll have to psychoanalyze you, young man. I don't care what you do if you can offer any hope, he declared vehemently. Let's get it over. Not as easy as all that, rumbled Horker. It takes time, and besides, it can't be successful with the subject in a hectic mood such as yours. He glanced at his watch. Moreover, it's after midnight. He turned to Nicholas Devine. We'll make it Saturday evening, he said. Meanwhile, young man, you're not to see Pat. Not at all, understand? You can see her here when you come. That's infinitely more than I'd planned for myself, said the youth in a low voice. I'd abandoned the hope of seeing her. He rose and moved toward the door, and the others followed. At the entrance he paused. He leaned down to plant a brief, tender kiss on the girl's lips, and moved wordlessly out of the door. Pat watched him enter his car and followed the vehicle with her eyes until it disappeared. Then she turned to Horker. "Do you really know anything about it?" she queried. "Have you any theory at all?" "He's not lying," said the doctor thoughtfully. "I watched him closely. He believes he's telling the truth." "He is! I know what I saw." "He hasn't the signs of praecox or depressive," mused the doctor. "It's puzzling. It's one of those functional aberrations, or a fixed delusion of some kind. We'll find out just what it is." "It's the devil," declared Pat positively. "I don't care what sort of scientific tag you give it. That's what it is. You doctors can hide a lot of ignorance under a long name." Horker paid no attention to her remarks. "We'll see what the psychoanalysis brings out," he said. "I shouldn't be surprised if the whole thing were the result of a defense mechanism erected by a timid child in an effort to evade responsibility. That's what it sounds like." "It's a devil!" reiterated Pat. "Well," said the doctor, "if it is, it has one thing in common with every spook or devil I ever heard of." "What's that?" "It refuses to appear under any conditions where one has a chance to examine it. It's like one of these temperamental mediums trying to perform under a spotlight." End of chapter 22. Recording by Rebecca. Chapter 23 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 23. Werewolf. Pat awoke in rather better spirits. Somehow the actual entrance of Dr. Horker in the case gave her a feeling of security, and her natural optimistic nature rode the pendulum back from despair to hope. Even the painful black and blue mark on her arm, as she examined it ruefully, failed to shake her buoyant mood. Her mood held most of the day. It was only at evening that a recurrence of doubt assailed her. She sat in the dim living room, waiting the arrival of her mother's guests, and wondered whether, after all, the predicament was as easily solvable as she had assumed. She watched the play of lights and shadows across the ceiling, patterns cast through the windows by moving headlights in the street, and wondered anew whether her faith in Dr. Horker's abilities was justified. Science. She had the faith of her generation in its omnipotence, but here in the dusk, the outworn superstitions of childhood became appalling realities, and some of Magda's stories, forgotten now for years, rose out of their graves and went squeaking and maundering like sheeted ghosts in a ghastly parade across the universe of her mind. The meaningless taunts she habitually flung at Dr. Carl's science became suddenly pregnant with truth. His patient, hard-learned science seemed in fact no more than the frenzies of a witch-doctor dancing in the heart of a Rhodesian swamp. What was it worth, this array of medical facts, if it failed to cure? Was medicine falling into the state of Chinese science, a vast collection of good rules for which the reasons were either unknown or long forgotten? She sighed. It was with a feeling of profound relief that she heard the voices of the Brocks outside. She played miserable bridge the whole evening, but it was less of an affliction than the solitude of her own thoughts. Saturday morning, cloudy and threatening though it was, found the pendulum once more at the other end of the arc. She found herself, if not buoyantly cheerful, at least no longer prey to the inchoate doubts and fears of the preceding evening. She couldn't even recall their nature. They had been apart from the cool, daytime logic that preached a common-sense reliance on accepted practices. They had been, she concluded, no more than childish nightmares induced by darkness and the play of shadows. She dressed and ate a late breakfast. Her mother was already en route to the club for her bridge luncheon. Thereafter, she wandered into the kitchen for the company of Magda, whom she found with massive arms immersed in dishwater. Pat perched on her particular stool beside the kitchen table and watched her at her work. "Magda," she said finally. "I'm listening, Miss Pat." "Do you remember a story you told me a long time ago?"
Oh, years and years ago, about a man in your town who could change into some fierce animal, a wolf or something like that." "Oh, him," said Magda, knitting her heavy brows. "You mean the werewolf?" "That's it, the werewolf. I remember it now, how frightened I was after I went to bed. I wasn't more than 8 years old, was I?" "I couldn't remember. It was years ago, though, for sure." "What was the story?" queried Pat. "Do you remember that?" "Why, it was the time the sheep were being missed," said the woman, punctuating her words with the clatter of dishes on the drain board. "Then there was a child gone, and another, and then tales of this great wolf about the country. I didn't see him. Us little ones stayed under roof by darkness after that." "That wasn't all of it," said Pat. "You told me more than that." "Well," continued Magda, "there was my uncle, who was best hand with a rifle in the village. He and others went after the creature, and my uncle, he came back telling how he'd seen it plain against the sky, and how he'd fired at it. He couldn't miss, he was that close, but the wolf gave him a look and ran away." "And then what?" "Then the priest came, and he said it wasn't a natural wolf. He melted up a silver coin and cast a bullet, and he gave it to my uncle, he being the best shot in the village, and the next night he went out once more." "Did he get it?" asked Pat. "I don't remember." "He did. He came upon it by the pasture, and he aimed his gun. The creature looked straight at him with its evil red eyes, and he shot it. When he came to it, there wasn't a wolf at all, but this man, his name I forget, with a hole in his head. And then the priest, he said he was a werewolf, and only a silver bullet could kill him. But my uncle, he said those evil red eyes kept staring at him for many nights." "Evil red eyes!" said Pat suddenly. "Magda," she asked in a faint voice, "could he change any time he wanted to?" "Only by night," the priest said. "By sunrise he had to be back." "Only by night," mused the girl. Another idea was forming in her active little mind, another conception, disturbing, impossible to phrase. "Is that worse than being possessed by a devil, Magda?" "Sure it's worse! The priest, he could cast out the devil, but I never heard no cure for being a werewolf." Pat said nothing further, but slid from her high perch to the floor and went soberly out of the kitchen. The fears of last night had come to life again, and now the overcast skies outside seemed a fitting symbol to her mood. She stared thoughtfully out of the living room window, and the sudden splash of raindrops against the pane lent a final touch to the whole desolate ensemble. "I'm just a superstitious little idiot," she told herself. "I laugh at Mother because she always likes to play North and South, and here I am letting myself worry over superstitions that were discarded before there was any such thing as a game called contract bridge." But her arguments failed to carry conviction. The memory of the terrible eyes of that other had clicked too aptly to Magda's phrase. She couldn't subdue the picture that haunted her, and she couldn't cast off the apprehensiveness of her mood. She recalled gloomily that Dr. Horker was at the club, wouldn't be home before evening, else she'd have gladly availed herself on his solid matter-of-fact company. She thought of Nick's appointment with the doctor for that evening. Suppose his psychoanalysis brought to light some such horror as these fears of hers, that would forever destroy any possibility of happiness for her and Nick. Even though the doctor refused to recognize it, called it by some polysyllabic scientific name, the thing would be there to sever them. She wandered restlessly into the hall. The morning mail, unexamined, lay in its brazen receptacle. She moved over, fingering it idly. Abruptly she paused in astonishment. A letter in familiar script had flashed at her. She pulled it out. It was! It was a letter from Nicholas Devine. She tore it open nervously, wondering whether he had reverted to his original refusal of Dr. Horker's aid, whether he was unable to come, whether that had happened. But only a single unfolded sheet slipped from the envelope, inscribed with a few brief lines of poetry. The grief that is too faint for tears, and scarcely breathes of pain, may linger on 100 years, ere it creep forth again. But I, who love you now too well to suffer your disdain, must try tonight that love to quell, and try in vain. End of chapter 23. Recording by Rebecca.
Chapter 24 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 24. The Dark Other. It was early in the evening, not yet 8 o'clock, when Pat saw the car of Nicholas Devine draw up before the house. She had already been watching half an hour, sitting cross-legged in the deep window seat, like her jade Buddha. That equivocal poem of his had disturbed her, lent an added strength to the moods and doubts already implanted by Magda's mystical tale, and it was with a feeling of trepidation that she watched him emerge wearily from his vehicle and stare in indecision first at her window and then at the Horker residence. The waning daylight was still sufficient to delineate his worn features. She could see them, pale, harried, but indubitably the mild features of her own Nick. While he hesitated, she darted to the door and out upon the porch. He gave her a wan smile of greeting, advanced to the foot of the steps, and halted there. "The doctor's not home yet," she called to him. He stood motionless below her. "Come up on the porch," she invited, as he made no move. She uttered the words with a curious feeling of apprehension, for even as she ached for his presence, the uncertain state of affairs was frightening. She thought fearfully that what had happened before might happen again. Still, there on the open porch, in practically full daylight, and for so brief a time, Dr. Carl would be coming very shortly, she reasoned. "I can't," said Nick, staring wistfully at her. "You know I can't." "Why not?" "I promised. You remember, I promised Dr. Horker I'd not see you except in his presence." "So you did," said Pat doubtfully. The promise offered escaped from a distressing situation, she thought, and yet, somehow, seeing Nick standing pathetically there, she couldn't imagine anything harmful emanating from him. There had been many and many evenings in his company that had passed delightfully, enjoyably, safely. She felt a wave of pity for him. After all, the affliction was his, most of the suffering was his. "We needn't take it so literally," she said almost reluctantly. "He'll be home very soon now." "I know," said Nick soberly, "but it was a promise, and besides, I'm afraid." "Never mind, honey," she said after a momentary hesitation. "Come up and sit here on the steps then, here beside me. We can talk just as well as there on the settee." He climbed the steps and seated himself, watching Pat with longing eyes. He made no move to touch her, nor did she suggest a kiss. "I read your poem, honey," she said finally. "It worried me. I'm sorry, Pat. I couldn't sleep. I kept wandering around the house, and at last I wrote it and took it out and mailed it. It was a vent, a relief from the things I'd been thinking." "What things, honey?" "A way, mostly," he answered gloomily, "of removing myself from your life. A permanent way." "Nick!" "I didn't, as you see, Pat. I was too cowardly, I suppose. Or perhaps it was because of this forlorn hope of ours. There's always hope, Pat. Even the condemned man with his foot on the step of the gallows feels it." "Nick, dear," she cried, her voice quavering in pity. "Nick, you mustn't think of those things. It might weaken you, make it easier for him." "It can't. If it frightens him, I'm glad." "Honey," she said soothingly, "we'll give Dr. Carl a chance. Promise me you'll let him try, won't you?" "Of course I will. Is there anything I'd refuse to promise you, Pat? Even," he added bitterly, "when reason tells me it's a futile promise." "Don't say it," she urged fiercely. "We've got to help him. We've got to believe. There he comes," she finished with sudden relief. The doctor's car turned up the driveway beyond his residence. Pat saw his face regarding them as he disappeared behind the building. "Come on, honey," she said. "Let's get at the business." They moved slowly over to the doctor's door, waiting there until his ponderous footsteps sounded. A light flashed in the hall, and his broad shadow filled the door for a moment before it opened. "Come in," he rumbled jovially. "Fine evening we're spoiling, isn't it?" "It could be," said Pat as they followed him into the library, "only it'll probably rain some more." "Ah!" snorted the doctor, frowning at the mention of rain. "The course was soft, couldn't get any distance, and it added 6 strokes to my score, at least 6." Pat chuckled commiseratingly. "You ought to lay out a course in Greenland," she suggested. "They say anyone can drive a ball a quarter of a mile on smooth ice." "Humph!" The doctor waved toward a great low chair. "Suppose you sit over there, young man, and we'll get about our business. And don't look so woebegone about it." Nick settled himself nervously in the designated chair. The doctor seated himself at a little distance to the side, and Pat sat tensely in her usual place beside the hearth. She waited in strained impatience for the black magic of psychoanalysis to commence. "Now," said Horker, "I want you to keep quiet, Pat, if possible. And you, young man, are to relax, compose yourself, get yourself into as passive a state as possible. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The youth leaned back in the great chair, closing his eyes. "So, now, think back to your childhood, your earliest memories. Let your thoughts wander at random and speak whatever comes to your mind." Nick sat a moment in silence. "That's hard to do, sir," he said finally. "Yes, it will take practice, weeks of it perhaps. You'll have to acquire the knack of it, but to do that we'll have to start." "Yes, sir." He sat with closed eyes. "My mother," he murmured, "was kind. I remember her a little, just a little. She was very gentle, not apt to blame me. She could understand, made excuses to my father. He was hard. Not cruel, strict. Couldn't understand. Blamed me when I wasn't to blame. Other did it. I wasn't mischievous, but got the blame. Couldn't explain. He wouldn't believe me." He paused uncertainly. "Go on," said Horker quietly, while Pat strained her ears to listen. "Mrs. Stevens," he continued. "Governess after mother died. Strict like father. Got punished when I wasn't to blame. Just as bad after father died. Always blamed. Couldn't explain. Nobody believed me. Other threw cat in window. I had to go to bed. Put salt in bird seed. Broke a leg off chair to make it fall. Punished. I couldn't explain." His voice droned into silence. He opened his eyes. "That's all," he said nervously. "Good enough for the first time," said the doctor briskly. "Wait a few weeks, we'll have your life's history out of you. It takes practice." "Is that all?" queried Pat in astonishment. "All for the first time. Later we'll let him talk half an hour at a stretch, but it takes practice, as I've mentioned. You run along home now," he said to Nick. "But it's early," objected Pat. "Early or not," said the doctor, "I'm tired, and you two aren't to see each other except here. You remember that." Nick rose from his seat in the depths of the great chair. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I don't know why, but I feel easier in your presence. The struggle disappears while I'm here." "Well," said Horker with a smile, "I like patients with confidence in me. Good night." At the door, Nick paused, turning wistful eyes on Pat. "Good night," he said, leaning to give her a light kiss. A rush of some emotion twisted his features. He stared strangely at the girl. "I'd better go," he said abruptly, and vanished through the door. "Well?" said Pat questioningly, turning to the doctor. "Did you learn anything from that?" "Not much," the other admitted, yawning. "However, the results bear out my theory." "How?" "Did you notice how he harped on the undeserved punishment theme? He was punished for another's mischief?" "Yes, what of that?" "Well, picture him as a timid, sensitive child, rather afraid of being punished. Afraid, say, of being locked up in a dark closet. Now, when he inadvertently commits a mischief, as all children do, he tries desperately to divert the blame from himself. But there's no one else to blame. So what does he do?" "What?" "He invents this other, the mischievous one, and blames him. And now the other has grown to the proportions of a delusion, haunting him, driving him to commit acts apart from his normal inclinations. Understand? Because I'm off to bed whether you do or not." "I understand all right," murmured Pat uncertainly as she moved to the door. "But somehow it doesn't sound reasonable." "It will," said the doctor. "Good night." Pat wandered slowly down the steps and through the break in the hedge, musing over Dr. Horker's expression of opinion. Then, according to him, the devil was nothing more than an invention of Nick's mind, the trick of a cowardly child to evade just punishment. She shook her head. It didn't sound like Nick at all. For all his gentleness and sensitivity, he wasn't the one to hide behind a fabrication. He wasn't a coward, she was certain of that. And she was as sure as she could ever be that he hated, feared, loathed this personality that afflicted him. He couldn't have created it. She sighed, mounted the steps, and fumbled for her key. The sound of a movement behind her brought a faint gasp of astonishment. She turned to see a figure materializing from the shadows of the porch. The light from the hall fell across its features, and she drew back as she recognized Nicholas Devine, not the being she had just kissed goodnight, but in the guise of her tormentor, the red-eyed demon. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 25. The Demon Lover. Pat drew back, leaning against the door, and her key tinkled on the concrete of the porch. She was startled, shocked, but not as completely terrified as she might have expected. After all, she thought rapidly, they were standing in full view of a public street, and Dr. Carl's residence was but a few feet distant. She could summon his help by screaming. "Well," she exclaimed, eyeing the figure inimically, "your appearances and disappearances are beginning to remind me of the Cheshire cat." "Except for the grin," said the other in his cold tones. "What do you want?" snapped Pat. "You know what I want." "You'll not get it," said the girl angrily. You're doomed to extinction anyway. Go away." "Suppose," said the other with a strange, cold, twisted smile, "it were he that's doomed to extinction. What then?" "It isn't!" cried Pat. "It isn't!" she repeated, while a quiver of uncertainty shook her. "He's the stronger," she added defiantly. "Then where is he now?" "Dr. Carl will help us." "Doctor!" sneered the other. "He and his clever theory. Am I an illusion?" he queried sardonically, thrusting his red glinting eyes toward her. "Am I the product of his puerile, vacillating nature? Bah! I gave you the clue, and your doctor hasn't the intelligence to follow it." "Go away," murmured Pat faintly. The approach of his face had unnerved her, and she felt terror beginning to stir within her. "Go away," she said again. "Why do you have to torment me? Anyone would serve your purpose. Any woman." "You have an aesthetic appeal, as I've told you before," replied the other in that toneless voice of his. "There is a pleasure in the defacement of black hair and pale skin, and your body is seductive, most seductive. Another might afford me less enjoyment, and besides, you hate me. Don't you hate me?" He peered evilly at her. "Oh God, yes!" The girl was shuddering. "Say it then. Say you hate me." "I hate you!" the girl cried vehemently. "Will you go away now?" "With you." "I'll scream if you come any closer. You don't dare touch me. I'll call Dr. Horker." "You'll only damage him, your lover." "Then I'll do it. He'll understand." "Yes," said the other reflectively. "He's fool enough to forgive you. He'll forgive you anything, the weakling." "Go away! Get away from here!" The other stared at her out of bloodshot eyes. "Very well," he said in his flat tones. "This time the victory is yours." He backed slowly toward the steps. Pat watched him as he moved, feeling a surge of profound relief. As his shadow shifted, her key gleamed silver at her feet, and she stooped to retrieve it. There was a rush of motion as her eyes left the form of her antagonist. A hand clamped violently over her mouth, an arm passed with steel-like rigidity about her body. Nicholas Devine was dragging her toward the steps. She was halfway down before she recovered her wits enough to struggle. She writhed and twisted in his grasp. She drove her elbow into his body with all her power, and kicked with the strength of desperation at his legs. She bit into the palm across her mouth, and suddenly, with a subdued grunt of pain, he released her so abruptly that her own struggles sent her spinning blindly into the bushes of the hedge. She turned gasping, unable for the moment to summon sufficient breath to scream. The other stood facing her with his eyes gleaming terribly into her own. Then they ranged slowly from her diminutive feet to the rumpled ebony of her hair that she was brushing back with her hands from her pallid, frightened face. "Obstinate," he observed, rubbing his injured palm. "Obstinate and unbroken, but worth the trouble. Well worth it." He reached out a swift hand, seizing her wrist as she backed against the bushes. Pat twisted around, gazing frantically at Dr. Horker's house, where a light had only now flashed on in the upper windows. Her breath flowed back into her lungs with a strengthening rush. "Dr. Carl!" she screamed. "Dr. Carl! Help me!" The other spun her violently about. She had a momentary glimpse of a horribly evil countenance, then he drew back his arm and shot a clenched fist to her chin. The world reeled into a blaze of spinning lights that faded quickly to darkness. She felt her knees buckling beneath her and realized that she was crumpling forward toward the figure before her. Then, for a moment, she was aware of nothing. She didn't quite lose consciousness, or at least for no more than a moment. She was suddenly aware that she was gazing down at a moving pavement, at her own arms dangling helplessly toward it. She perceived that she was lying limply across Nicholas Devine's shoulder with his arms clenched about her knees. And then, still unable to make the slightest resistance, she was bundled roughly into the seat of his coupe. He was beside her, and the car was purring into motion. She summoned what remained of her strength. She drew herself erect, fumbling at the handle of the door with a frantic idea of casting herself out of the car to the street. The creature beside her jerked her violently back. As she reeled into the seat, he struck her again with the side of his fist. It was a random blow, delivered with scarcely a glance at her. It caught her on the forehead, snapping her head with an audible thump against the wall of the vehicle. She swayed for a moment with closing eyes, then collapsed limply against him, this time in complete unconsciousness. The lapse, too, must have been brief. She opened dazed eyes on a vista of moving streetlights. They were still in the car, passing now along some unrecognized thoroughfare lined with dark old homes. She lay for some moments uncomprehending. She was completely unaware of her situation. It dawned on her slowly. She moaned, struggled away from the shoulder against which she had been leaning, and huddled miserably in the far corner of the seat. Nicholas Devine gave her a single glance with his unpleasant eyes, and turned them again on the street. The girl was helpless, unable to put forth the strength even for another attempt to open the door. She was still only half aware of her position, and realized only that something appalling was occurring to her. She lay in passive misery against the cushions of the seat as the other turned suddenly up a dark driveway and into the open door of a small garage. He snapped off the engine, extinguished the headlights, and left them in a horrible, smothering, silent darkness. She heard him open the door on his side. After an apparently interminable interval, she heard the creak of the hinges on her own side. She huddled terrified, voiceless, and immobile. He reached in, fumbling against her in the darkness. He found her arm and dragged her from the car. Again, as on that other occasion, she found herself reeling helplessly behind him through the dark as he tugged at her wrist. He paused at a door in the building adjacent to the garage, searching in his pocket with his free hand. "I won't go in there," she muttered dazedly. The other made no reply, but inserted a key in the lock, turned it, and swung open the door. He stepped through it, dragging her after him. With a sudden access of desperate strength, she caught the frame of the door, jerked violently on her prisoned wrist, and was unexpectedly free. She reeled away, turned toward the street, and took a few faltering steps down the driveway. Almost instantly her tormentor was upon her, and his hand closed again on her arm. Pat had no further strength. She sank to the pavement and crouched there, disregarding the insistent tugging on her arm. "Come on," he growled. "You only delay the inevitable. Must I drag you?" She made no reply. He tugged violently at her wrist, dragging her a few inches along the pavement. Then he stooped over her, raised her in his arms, and bore her toward the dark opening of the door. He crowded her roughly through it, disregarding the painful bumping of her shoulders and knees. She heard the slam of the door as he kicked it closed, and she realized that they were mounting a flight of stairs, moving somewhere into the oppressive, threatening darkness. Then they were moving along a level floor, and her arm was bruised against another door. There was a moment of stillness, and then she was released, dropped indifferently to the surface of a bed or couch. A moment later a light flashed on. The girl was conscious at first only of the gaze of the red eyes. They held her own in a fascinating, unbreakable, trance-like spell. Then, in a wave of dizziness, she closed her own eyes. "Where are we?" she murmured. "In hell?" "You should call it heaven," came the sardonic voice. "It's the home of your sweetheart. His home. And mine." End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 26. The Depths. "Heaven and hell always were the same place," said Nicholas Devine, his red eyes glaring down at the girl. "We'll demonstrate the fact." Pat shifted wearily and sat erect, passing her hand dazedly across her face. She brushed the tangled strands of black hair from before her eyes and stared dully at the room in which she found herself. It had some of the aspects of a study, and some of a laboratory, or perhaps a doctor's office. There was a case of dusty books on the wall opposite, and another crystal-fronted cabinet containing glassware, bottles, little round boxes suggestive of drugs or pharmaceuticals. There was a paper-littered table, too. She gave a convulsive shudder at the sight of a bald, varnished death's head, its lower jaw articulated, that reposed on a pile of papers and grinned at her. "Where?" she began faintly. "This was the room of your sweetheart's father," said the other. "His and my mutual father. He was an experimenter, a researcher, and so, in another sense, am I." He leered evilly at her. "He used this chamber to further his experiments, and I for mine, the carrying on of a noble family tradition." The girl scarcely heard his words. The expressionless tone carried no meaning to the chaos which was her mind. She felt only an inchoate horror and a vague but all-encompassing fear, and her head was aching from the blows he had dealt her. "What do you want?" she asked dully. "Why, there is an unfinished experiment. You must remember our interrupted proceedings of a week ago. Have you already forgotten the early steps of our experiment in evil?" Pat cringed at the cold, sardonic tones of the other. "Let me go," she whimpered. "Please," she appealed, "let me go." "In due time," he responded. "You lack gratitude," he continued. "Last time, out of the kindness that is my soul, I permitted you to dull your senses with alcohol, but you failed apparently to appreciate my indulgence. But this time..." His eyes lit up queerly. "This time you approached the consummation of our experiment with undimmed mind." He approached her. She drew her knees up, huddling back on the couch, and summoned the final vestiges of her strength. "I'll kick you," she muttered desperately. "Keep back from me." He paused just beyond her reach. "I had hoped," he said ironically, "if not for your cooperation, at least for no further active resistance. It's quite useless. I told you days ago that this time would come." He advanced cautiously. Pat thrust out her foot, driving it with all her power. Instantly he drew back, catching her ankle in his hand. He jerked her leg sharply upwards, and she was precipitated violently to the couch. Again he advanced. The girl writhed away from him. She slipped from the foot of the couch and darted in a circle around him, turning in an attempt to gain the room's single exit, the door by which they had entered. He moved quickly to intercept her. He closed the door as she backed despairingly away, retreating to the far end of the room. Once more he faced her, his malicious eyes gleaming, and moved deliberately towards her. She drew back until the table halted her. She pressed herself against it as if to force her way still further.
The other moved at unaltered pace. Suddenly, her hand pressed over some smooth, round, hard object. She grasped it and flung the grinning skull at the more terrible face that approached her. He dodged. There was a crash of glass as the gruesome missile shattered the pane of the cabinet of drugs. And inexorably, Nicholas Devine approached once more. She moved along the edge of the table, squeezed herself between it and the wall. Behind her was one of the room's 2 windows, curtainless, with drawn shades. She found the cord, jerked it, and let the blind coil upward with an abrupt snap. "I'll throw myself through the window," she announced with a sort of desperate calm. "Don't dare move a step closer." The demon paused once more in his deliberate advance. "You will, of course," he said as if considering, "given the opportunity. Your body torn and broken, spotted with blood, that might be a pleasure second only to that I plan." "You'll suffer for it," said the girl hysterically. "I'll be glad to do it, knowing you'll suffer." "Not I, your sweetheart." "I don't care, I can't stand it." The other smiled his demonic smile, and resumed his advance. She watched him in terror that had now reached the ultimate degree. Her mind could bear no more. She turned suddenly, raised her arm, and beat her fist against the pane of the window. With the surprising resistance glass sometimes displays, it shook at her blow but did not shatter. She drew back for a second attempt, and her upraised arm was caught in a rigid grip, and she was dragged backward to the center of the room, thrown heavily to the floor. She sat up dazedly, looking up at the form standing over her. "Must I render you helpless again?" queried the flat voice of the other. "Are you not yet broken, convinced of the uselessness of this struggle?" She made no answer, staring dully at his immobile features. "Are you going to fight me further?" As she was still silent, he repeated, "Are you?" She shook her head vaguely. "No," she muttered. She had reached a point of utter indifference. Nothing at all was important enough now to struggle for. "Stand up," ordered the being above her. She pulled herself wearily to her feet, leaning against the wall. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them dully as the other moved. "What are you going to do?" she murmured. "First," said the demon coldly, "I shall disrobe you somewhat more completely than on our other occasion. Thereafter we will proceed to the consummation of our experiment." She watched him indifferently, uncomprehendingly, as he crooked a thin finger in the neck of her frock. She felt the pressure as he pulled, heard the rip of the fabric and the pop of buttons, but she was conscious of no particular sensation as the garment cascaded into a black and red pool at her feet. She stood passive as he hooked his finger in the strap of her vest, and that too joined the little mound of cloth. She shivered slightly as she stood bared to the waist, but gave no other sign. Again the thin hand moved toward her. From somewhere in her tormented spirit a final shred of resistance arose, and she pushed the questing member feebly to one side. She heard a low, sardonic laugh from her oppressor. "Look at me," he commanded. She raised her eyes wearily. She drew her arm around her in a forlorn gesture of concealment. Her eyes met the strange orbs of the other, and a faint thrill of horror stirred. Other than this, she felt nothing. Then his eyes were approaching her. She was conscious of the illusion that they were expanding, filling all the space in front of her. Their weird glow filled the world, dominating everything. "Will you yield?" he queried. The eyes commanded. "Yes," she said dully. She felt his hands icy cold on her bare shoulders. They traveled like a shudder about her body, and suddenly she was pressed close to him. "Are you mine?" he demanded. For the first time there was a tinge of expression in the toneless voice, a trace of eagerness. She made no answer. Her eyes, held by his, stared like the eyes of a person in a trance, unwinking, fascinated. "Are you mine?" he repeated, his breath hissing on her cheek. Yes, she heard her own voice in automatic reply to his question. Mine. For the delights of evil? Yours, she murmured. The eyes had blotted out everything. And do you hate me? No. The arms about her tightened into crushing bands. The pressure stopped her breath. Her very bones seemed to give under their fierce compression. Do you hate me? He muttered. Yes, she gasped. Yes, I hate you! Ah. He twisted his hand into her black hair, wrenching it roughly back. Are you ready now for the consummation? To look upon the face of evil? She made no reply. Her eyes, as glassy as those of a sleepwalker, stared into his. Are you ready? Yes, she said. He pressed his mouth to hers. The fierceness of the kiss bruised her lips. The pull of his hand into her hair was a searing pain. The pressure of his arm about her body was a suffocation. Yet, somehow, there was again the dawning of that unholy pleasure, the same degraded delight that had risen in her on that other occasion, in the room of the red-checked tablecloth. Through some hellish alchemy, the leaden pain was transmuting itself into the garish gold of a horrible, abnormal pleasure. She found her crushed lips attempting a feeble, painful response. At her movement, she felt herself swung abruptly from her feet. With his lips still crushing hers, he raised her in his arms. She felt herself borne across the room. He paused. There was a sudden release, and she crashed to the hard surface of the couch, whose rough covering scratched the bare flesh of her back. Nicholas Devine bent over her. She saw his hand stretched toward her single remaining garment. And again, from somewhere in her harassed soul, a spark of resistance flashed. Nick, she moaned. Oh, Nick, help me. Call him, said the other, a sneer on his face. Call him. He hears. It adds to his torment. She covered her eyes with her hands. She felt his hand slip coldly between her skin and the elastic about her waist. Nick, she moaned again. Nick, oh my God, Nick! End of chapter 26. Recording by Rebecca.
Chapter 27 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 27. 2 in Hell. The cold hand against Pat was still. She felt it rigid and stiff on her flesh. She lay passive with closed eyes, having voiced her final appeal. She was through. The words torn from her misery represented the final iota of spirit remaining to her, and her bruised body and battered mind had nothing further to give. The hand quivered and withdrew. For a moment more she lay motionless with her arms clutched about her. Then she opened her eyes, gazing dully, hopelessly at the demon standing over her. He was watching her with a curious abstracted frown. As she stirred, the scowl intensified, and he drew back a step. His face contorted suddenly in a spasm of some unguessable emotion. His fists clenched. A low, unintelligible mutter broke from his lips. "Strange," she heard him say, and after a moment, "I'm still master here." He was master. In a moment the emotion vanished, and he was again standing over her, his face the same impassive, demoniac mask. She watched him in a dull stupor of despair that was too deep for even a whimper of pain, as he wrenched at the elastic about her waist, and it cut into her flesh and parted. He tore the garment away, and the red eyes bored down with a wild elation in their depths. "Mine," the being muttered, a new hoarseness in his voice. "Are you mine?" Pat made no answer. His voice croaked in more insistent tones. "Are you mine?" She could not reply. She felt his fingers bite into the flesh of her shoulder. She was shaken roughly, violently, and the question came again fiercely. The eyes flamed in command, and she felt through her languor and weakness the stirring of that strange and unholy fascination that he held over her. "Answer," he croaked. "Are you mine?" The torture of his searing grip on her shoulder wrung an answer from her. "Yes," she murmured faintly. "Yours." She closed her eyes again in helpless resignation. She felt the hand withdrawn, and she lay passive, waiting, on the verge of unconsciousness, numb, spirit broken and beaten. Nothing happened. After a long interval she opened her eyes and saw the other standing again with clenched fists and contorted countenance. His features were writhing in the intensity of his struggle. A strange low snarl came from his lips. He backed away from her, step by step. He leaned against the bookshelves, and beads of perspiration formed on his scowling face. He was no longer master. She saw the change. Imperceptibly the evil vanished from his features, and suddenly they were no longer his, but the weary, horror-stricken visage of her Nick. The red eyes were no longer satanic, but only bloodshot, troubled, gentle eyes of her sweetheart, and the lips had lost their grimness, and gasped and quivered and trembled. He reeled against the wall, staggered to the chair at the table, and sank weakly into it. Pat was far too exhausted, far too dazed, to feel anything but the faintest sensation of relief. She realized only dimly that tears were welling from her eyes, and that sharp sobs were shaking her. She was for the moment unable to stir, and it was not long until the being at the table turned stricken eyes on her that she moved. Then she drew her knees up before her as if to hide her body behind their slim, chiffon-clad grace. Nick rose from the table, approaching her with weary, hesitant tread. He seized the cover of some sort that was folded over the foot of the couch, shook it out, and cast it over her. She clutched it about her body, sat erect, and leaned back against the wall in utter exhaustion. Many minutes passed with no word from either of the occupants of the unholy chamber. It was Nick who broke the long silence. "Pat," he murmured in low tones. "Pat, dear, are you all right?" She stared at him dazedly, without answer. "Honey," he said. "Honey, tell me you're all right." "All right?" she repeated uncomprehendingly. "Yes, I guess I'm all right." "Then go, Pat. Get away from here before anything happens. Put your clothes on and hurry away." "I can't," she said faintly. "I can't." "You must, honey." "I'm just not able to. I will soon, Nick, honest, when I get my breath back." "Pat!" There was anguish in the cry. "Oh, God, Pat, we mustn't ever be together again, not ever." "No," she said. A bit of sanity was returning to her. Comprehension of her position sent a shudder through her. "No, we mustn't." "I couldn't bear another night like this, watching. I'd go mad." "Oh," she choked, tears starting. "If you hadn't come back, Nick." "I conquered him," he said. "I don't think I could do it again. It was your call that gave me the strength, Pat." He shook his head as if bewildered. He thought it was being in love with you that weakened me, but in the end it was that which gave me the strength to subdue him. "I'm scared," said the girl suddenly. "Oh, Nick, I'm frightened." "You'd better go. You'd better dress and leave at once, honey. Here." He gathered her clothes from the floor, depositing them beside her on the couch. "There are pins in the tray on the table, Pat. Fix yourself up as well as you can, dear, and hurry out of here." He turned toward the door as if to leave, and a shock of terror shook her. Nick," she cried, "don't go away. I'm more afraid when I can't see you. Afraid that he—" She broke off, sobbing. "All right, honey, I'll turn my back." She slipped out from under the blanket, found the pins, repaired her ruined costume. The frock was torn, crushed, and bedraggled. She pinned it together at the throat, though her trembling fingers made the task difficult. She pulled it on and took a tentative step toward the door. "Nick," she called, as a wave of dizziness sent her swaying against the wall. "What's the matter, honey?" He turned anxiously at her cry. "I'm dizzy," she moaned. "My head aches, and I'm scared." "Pat, darling, you can't go out alone like this. And," he added miserably, "I can't take you." He slipped his arm around her tenderly, supporting her to the couch. "Honey, what'll we do?" "I'll be all right," she murmured. "I'll go in a moment." The dizziness was leaving her. Strength was returning. "You must," he said dolefully. "What a parting, Pat! Never to see you again, and then having this to remember as farewell." "I know, Nick. You see, I love you too." She turned her dark, troubled eyes on him. "Honey, kiss me good-bye. We'll have that to remember anyway." Tears were again on her cheeks. "Do I dare?" he asked despondently. "After the things these lips of mine have said, and what these arms have done to you? But you didn't, Nick. Could I blame you for that other?" "God, you're kind, Pat. Honey, if ever I win out in this battle, if ever I know I'm the final victor, I'll—" "No," he said, his tones dropping abruptly. "I'll never come back to you, Pat. It's far too dangerous. And can I ever be certain? Can I? I don't know, Nick. Can you?" "I can't be, Pat. I'll never be sure that he isn't just dormant, as he was before, waiting for my weakness to betray me. I'll never be certain, honey. It has to be goodbye." "Then kiss me." She clung to him. The room that had been so recently a chamber of horrors was transformed. As she held him, as her lips were pressed to his, she thought suddenly of the words of the demon, that heaven and hell were always the same place. They had taken on a new meaning, those words. She drew away from Nick and turned her tear-bright eyes tenderly on his. "Honey," she murmured, "I don't want you to leave me. I don't want you to go." "Nor do I want to, Pat, but I must." "You mustn't. You're to stay, and we'll fight it out together, be married, or any way that permits us to fight it through together." "Pat, do you think I'd consent to that?" "Nick," she said, "Nick, darling, it's worth it to me. I'm realizing it now. I thought it wasn't, but it is. I can't lose you, Nick. Anything, even that other, is better than losing you." "You're sweet, Pat. You know I'd trade my very soul for that. But no, I can't do it. And don't, honey, torture me by suggesting it again." "But I will, Nick." She was speaking softly, earnestly. "You're worth anything to me. If he should kill me, you'd still be worth it." She gazed tenderly at him. "I'd want to die anyway, without you." "No more than I without you," he muttered brokenly. "But I won't do it, Pat. I won't do that to you." "I love you, Nick," she said in a low voice. "I don't want to live without you. Do you understand me, dear? I don't want to live without you." He stared at her somberly. "I've thought of that too," he said. "Pat, if I only believed that we'd be together after, together anywhere, I'd say yes. If only I believed there were an afterwards. Doesn't he prove that by his very existence? Your doctor would deny that. Dr. Carl never saw him, Nick. And anyway, even oblivion together would be better than being separated, and far better than this." He gazed at her silently. She spoke again. "That doesn't frighten me, Nick. It's only losing you that frightens me, especially the fear of losing you to him." He continued his silent gaze. Suddenly he drew her close to him and held her in a tight, tender embrace. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 28. Lunar Omen. After a considerable interval, during which Nick held the girl tightly and silently in his arms, he released her, sat with his head resting on his cupped palms in an attitude of deep study. Pat, beside him, fell mechanically to repinning the throat of her frock, which had opened during the moments of the embrace. He rose to his feet, pacing nervously before her. "It isn't a thing to do on the impulse of a moment, Pat," he muttered, pausing at her side. "You must see that. It isn't the impulse of a moment. But one doesn't abandon everything, the whole world, so easily, honey. One doesn't cast away a last hope, however forlorn a hope it may be." "Is there a hope, Nick?" she asked gently. "Is there a chance left to us?" "I don't know." His voice held an increasing tenseness. "Before God, I don't know. If there's a chance, the very slightest shadow of a spectre of a chance, we'll take it, won't we? Because the other way is always open to us, Nick." "Yes, it's always open." "But we won't take that chance," she continued defiantly, "if it involves my losing you, honey. I meant what I said, Nick. I don't want to live without you." "What chance have we?" he queried somberly. "Those are our alternatives. Life apart, death together." "Then you know my choice," she cried desperately. "Nick, honey, don't let's draw it out in futile talking. I can't stand it." He moved his hand in a gesture of bewilderment and frustration, and turned away, striding nervously toward the window whose blind she had raised. He leaned his hands on the table, peering dejectedly out upon the street below. "What time?" he asked irrelevantly, in a queer voice. "Did the doctor say the moon rose? Do you remember?" "No," she said tensely. "Oh, honey, please don't stand there with your back to me now when I'm half crazy." "I'm thinking," he responded. "It rises a little earlier each night, or is it later? No matter. Come here, Pat." She rose wearily and joined him. He slipped his arm about her and drew her against him. "Look there," he said, indicating the night-dark vista beyond the window. She looked out upon a dim lit street or court, at the blind end of which the house was apparently situated. Far off at the open end, across a distant highway, where even at this hour passed a constant stream of traffic, flashed a narrow strip of lake, and above it, rising gigantic from the coruscating moon path, lifted the satellite. She watched the remote flickering of the waves as they tossed back the broken bits of the light strewn along the path, and then she turned puzzled eyes on her companion. "That's heaven," he said, pointing a finger at the great flowing lunar disk. "There's a world that never caught the planet cancer called life. Or if it ever suffered, it's cured, clean, burned clean by the sun, and scoured clean by the airless zero of space. A dead world, and therefore not an unhappy one." The girl stared at him without comprehension. She murmured, "I don't understand, Nick." "Don't you, Pat?" He pointed again at the moon. "That's heaven, the dead world, and this is hell, the living one. Heaven and hell swinging forever about their common center." He gestured toward the sparkling moon path on the water. "Look, Pat, the dead world strews flowers on the grave of the living one." Some of his bitter ecstasy caught the girl. She felt his somber mood of exaltation. "I love you, Nick," she whispered, pressing closely to him. "What difference does it make, our actions?" he queried. "There's the omen, that lifeless globe in the sky. Where we go, all humanity now living will follow before a century. And In 1,000,000 years, the human race as well. What if we go a year or 1,000,000 years before the rest? Will it make any difference in the end?" He looked down at her. "All we've been valuing here is hope. To the devil with hope. Let's have peace instead." "I'm not afraid, Nick." "Nor I. And if we go, he goes, and he's mortally afraid of death." "Can he prevent you?" "Not now. I'm the stronger now. For this time I'm master." He turned again to stare at the glowing satellite as it rose imperceptibly from the horizon. "There's nothing to regret," he murmured, "except one thing, the loss of beauty. Beauty like that, and like you, Pat. That's bitterly hard to forswear." He leaned forward toward the remote disk of the moon. He spoke as if addressing it in tones so low that the girl, pressed close to him, had to quiet the sound of her own breath to listen. He said, "Long miles above cloud bank and blast, and many miles above the sea, I watch you rise majestically, feeling your chilly light at last. Cold beauty in the way you cast split silver fragments on the waves, as if this planet's life were past, and all men peaceful in their graves." Pat was silent for a moment as he paused. Then she murmured a low phrase. "Oh, I love you, Nick," she said. "And I you, dear," he responded. "Have we decided anything? Are we going through with it?" "I've not faltered," she said soberly. "I meant it, Nick. Without you, life would be as empty as that airless void you speak of. I'm not afraid. What's there to be afraid of?" "Only the transition, Pat. That and the unknown. But no situation could possibly be more terrible than our present one. It couldn't be. Oblivion, annihilation, they're preferable, aren't they?" "Oh, yes. Nothing I can imagine could be other than a change for the better." "Then let's face it." His voice took on a note of determination. "I've thought to face it 12 times before this, and each time I've hesitated. The hesitation of a coward, Pat." "You're no coward, dear. It was that illusion of hope that always weakens one. No one's strong who hasn't given up hope." "Then," he repeated, "let's face it." "How, Nick?" "My father has left us the means. There in the cabinet are 100 deaths. Swift ones, lingering ones, painful and easy. I don't know one from the other. Our choice must be blind." He strode over to the case, sending slivers of glass from the shattered front glistening along the floor. "I'd choose an easy one, dear, if I knew, for your sake, euthanasia." He stared hesitantly at the phials of mysterious drugs with their incomprehensible labels. Suddenly the scene appeared humorous to the girl, queerly funny, in some unnatural, horrible fashion. Her nerves, overstrained for hours, were on the verge of breaking. Without realization of it, she had come to the border of hysteria. "Shopping for death," she choked, trying to suppress the wild laughter that beat in her throat. "Which one's most suitable? Which one's most becoming? Which one," an hysterical laughing sob shook her, "will wear the longest?" He turned, gazing at her with an illogical concern in his face. "What's the difference?" she cried wildly. "I don't care. Painful or pleasant, it all ends in the same grave. Close your eyes and choose." Suddenly he was holding her in his arms again, and she was sobbing, clinging to him frantically. She was miserably unstrung. Her body shook under the impact of her gasping breath, and then gradually she quieted and was silent against him. "We've been mad," he murmured. "It's been an insane idea for me to inflict this on you, Pat. Do you think I could consider the destruction of your beauty, dear? I've been lying to myself, stifling my judgment with poetic imagery, when all the while it was just that I'm afraid to face the thing alone." "No," she murmured, burying her face against his shoulder. "I'm the coward, Nick. I'm the one that's frightened. and I'm the one that's broke down. It's just been too much this evening. I'm all right now. But we'll not go through with this, Pat. But we will. It's better than life without you, dear. We've argued and argued, and at last forgotten the one truth, the one thing I'll never retract. I can't face living without you, Nick. I can't." He brushed his hand wearily before his eyes. "Back at the starting point," he muttered. "All right, honey, so be it." He strode again to the cabinet. "Corrosive sublimate," he murmured. "Cyanide of potassium. They're both deadly, but I think the second is rapid and therefore less painful. Cyanide let it be." He extracted 2 small beakers from the glassware on the shelf. He filled them with water from a carafe on the table, and while the girl watched him with fascinated eyes, he deliberately tilted a spoonful or so of white crystals into each of them. The mixture swirled a moment, and then settled clear and colorless, and the crystals began to shrink as they passed swiftly into solution. "There it is," he announced grimly. "There's peace, oblivion, forgetfulness, and annihilation for you, for me, and for him. Beyond all doubt, the logical course for us, isn't it? Do we take it?" "Please," she said faintly. "Kiss me first, honey. Isn't that the proper course for lovers in this situation?" She felt a faint touch of astonishment at her own irony. The circumstances had ceased to have any reality to her, and had become merely a dramatic sequence, like the happenings in a play. He gathered her again into his arms and pressed his lips to hers. It was a long, tender, wistful kiss when at last it ended. Pat found her eyes again filled with tears, but not this time the tears of hysteria. "Nick," she murmured. "Nick, darling." He gave her a deep, somber, but very tender smile, and reached for one of the deadly beakers. "To another meeting," he said as his fingers closed on it. Suddenly, amazingly, the strident ring of a doorbell sounded, the more surprising since they had all but forgotten the existence of a world about them. Interruption. It meant only the going through once more of all that they had just passed. "Drink it," exclaimed Pat impulsively, seizing the remaining beaker. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 29. Scopolamine for Satan. The glass was struck from Pat's hand, and the water-clear contents streamed into pools and darkening blots over the table and its litter of papers. She stared unseeingly at the mess, without realizing that it was Nick who had dashed the draught from her very lips. She felt neither anger nor relief, but only a numbness and a sense of anticlimax. Somewhere below the bell was ringing again, and a door was resounding to violent blows, but she only continued her bewildered, questioning gaze. "I can't let you, Pat," he muttered, answering her unspoken query. "But, Nick, why?" "There's somebody at the door, isn't there? Mustn't we find out who?" "What difference can it make?" she asked wearily. "I don't know. I want to find out." "It's that illusion of hope again," she murmured. "That's all it is, Nick. And it means now that it's all to do over again. The whole thing from the beginning, and we were so near the end." "I know," he said miserably. "I know all that, but—" He paused as the insistent racket below was redoubled. "I'm going to answer that bell," he ended. He moved away from her, vanishing through the room's single door. She watched his disappearance without moving, but no sooner had he passed from sight that a curious feeling of fear oppressed her. She cast off the numbness and languor and darted after him into the darkness of the hall. "Nick!" she called. Somewhere ahead a light flashed on. She saw the well of a staircase and heard his footsteps descending. She followed in frantic haste, gaining the top step just as the pounding below ceased. She heard the click of the door and paused suddenly at the sound of a familiar voice. "Where's Pat?" The words drifted up in low, rumbling, ominous tones. "Dr. Carl!" she shrieked. She ran swiftly down the stairs to Nick's side, where he stood facing the great figure of the doctor. "Dr. Carl, how'd you find me?" The newcomer gave her a long, narrow-eyed, speculative survey. "I spent nearly the whole night doing it," he growled at her. "It took me hours to locate Mueller and get this address from him." He stepped forward, taking the girl's arm. "Come on," he said gruffly, without a glance at Nick, standing silently beside her. "I'm taking you home." She held back. "But why?" "Why? Because I don't like the company you keep. Is that reason enough?" She still resisted his insistent tug. "Nick hasn't done anything," she said defiantly, with a side glance at the youth's flushed, unhappy features. "He hasn't? Look at yourself, girl. Look at your clothes and your forehead. What's more, I saw enough from my window. I saw him bundle you into that car." His eyes were flashing angrily, and his grip on her arm tightened, while his free hand clenched into an enormous fist. "That wasn't Nick." "No, it was your devil, I suppose," said Hawker sarcastically. "Anyway, Pat, you're coming with me before I do violence to what remains of your devil." Nick spoke for the first time since the doctor's entrance. "Please do, Pat," he said softly. "Please go with him." "I won't," she snapped. The sudden shifts of situation during the long hours of that terrible evening were irritating her. She had alternated so rapidly between horror and hope and despair that her frayed nerves had seized now at the same reality of anger. Her mind, so long overstrained, was now deliberately forgetting her swing from the pit of terror to the verge of death. "You come up here like a hero to the rescue," she taunted the doctor. "Hairbreadth hooker!" "You little fool," growled the doctor. "A fine reception after losing a night's sleep. I'll drag you home if I have to." He moved ponderously toward the door. She gave a violent wrench and freed her arm from his grasp. "If you can, you mean," she jeered. She looked at his exasperated face, and suddenly, with one of her abrupt changes of mood, she softened. "Dr. Carl, honey," she said in apologetic tones, "I'm sorry. You're very sweet, and I'm really grateful, but I can't leave Nick now." Her eyes turned troubled. "Not now." "Why, Pat?" Mollified by the change in her mien, his voice rumbled in sympathetic notes. "I can't," she repeated. It's getting worse." "Bah!" "So it's bah," she flared. "Well, if you're so contemptuous of the thing, why don't you cure it? What good did your psychoanalysis do? You don't even know what it is." "What do you expect?" roared the doctor. "Can I diagnose it by absent treatment? I haven't had a chance to see the condition active yet." "All right," said Pat, her strained nerves driving her to impatience. "You're here, and Nick's here. Go on with your diagnosis. Get it over with, and let's see what you can do. You ought at least to be able to name the condition. The outstanding authority in the Middle East on neural and mental pathology." Her tone was sardonic. "Listen, Pat," said Hawker, with exaggerated patience, in the manner of one addressing a stupid child. "I've explained before that I can't get at the root of mental aberration when the subject is unstrung, as your young man here seems to be. Psychoanalysis just won't work unless the subject is calm, composed, and not in a nervous state. Can you comprehend that?" "Just dimly," she snapped. "You ought to know another way. You, the outstanding authority—" "Be still," he interrupted gruffly. Of course I know another way. If I wanted to drag all of us back to my office where I have the equipment, which I won't do tonight," he finished grimly, "then do it here." "I haven't what I need." "There's everything upstairs," said Pat. "It's all there, all Nick's father's equipment." "Not tonight. That's final." The girl's manner changed again. She turned troubled, imploring eyes on Horker. "Dr. Carl," she said plaintively, "I can't leave Nick now." She seized the arm of the silent, dejected youth who'd been standing passively by. "I can't leave him, really. I'd not be sure of seeing him again, ever. Please, Dr. Carl." "If these frenzies of yours," rumbled Horker, "are so violent and malicious, you ought to be confined. Do you know that, young man?" "Yes, sir," mumbled Nick wretchedly. "And I've thought of it," continued the doctor. "I've thought of it." "Please," cried Pat imploringly, "won't you try, Dr. Carl?" "The devil!" he growled. "All right, then." He followed the girl up the stairs, while Nick trailed disconsolately behind. She led him back into the chamber they had quitted, where a curious odor of peach pits seemed to scent the air. Horker sniffed suspiciously, then seized the remaining beaker, raising it cautiously to his nostrils. "Damnation!" he exploded. "Prussic acid or cyanide? What in—" He caught sight of Pat's tragic eyes and suddenly replaced the container. "Pat!" he groaned. "Pat, honey!" He drew her into the circle of his great arm. "I'll help you, dear, all I can, with all my heart, since it means that much to you." He groaned again under his breath. "Oh, my God!" He held her a moment, patting her tousled black head with his massive, delicate fingered hand. Then he released her, turning to Nick. "This the stuff?" he asked brusquely, indicating the cabinet of bottles with its splintered front. Nick nodded. Pat sank to the chair beside the table and watched Horker as he scanned the array of containers. He pulled out a tiny wooden case and snapped it open to reveal a number of steel needles that glinted brightly in the yellow light. He grunted in satisfaction and continued his inspection. "Atropine," he muttered, reading the labeled boxes. "Cocaine, daturine, iosine, iocyanamine. Won't do." "What do you need?" the girl queried faintly. "A mild hypnotic," said the doctor abstractedly, still searching. "Pretty good substitutes for psychoanalysis, certain drugs. Dulls the conscious mind, but not to complete unconsciousness. Good means of getting at the subconscious, see?" "Sort of," said Pat, "if it only works." "Oh, it'll work if we can find— Ah!" He seized a tiny cardboard box. "Scopolamine. This'll do the work." He extracted a tiny glassy something from one or other of the boxes he held, and frowned down at it. He seized the carafe of water, plunged something pointed and shiny into it. "Antiseptic," he muttered thoughtfully. He seized a brown bottle from the case, held it toward the light, and shook it. "Peroxide's gone flat," he growled. "Nothing but water." He pulled a silver cigar lighter from his pocket and snapped a yellow flame to it. He passed the point of the hypodermic rapidly back and forth through the little spear of fire. Finally he turned to Nick. "Take off your coat," he ordered. "Roll up your shirt sleeve, the left one, and sit over there." He indicated the couch along the wall. The youth obeyed without a word. The only indication of emotion was a long, miserable, wistful look at Pat as he seated himself impassively on the spot that the girl had so recently occupied. "Now," said the doctor briskly, approaching the youth, "this will make you drowsy, sleepy. That's all it'll do. Don't fight the effect. Just relax, let the thing take its course, and I'll see what I can get out of you." Pat gasped, and Nick winced as he drove the needle into the bared arm. "So," he said. "Now relax, lean back and close your eyes." He stepped to the door, dragged in a battered chair from the hall, and occupied it. He sat beside Pat, watching the pale features of the youth, who sat quietly with closed eyes, breathing slowly, heavily. "Long enough," muttered Hawker. He raised his voice. "Can you hear me?" He called to the motionless figure on the couch. There was no response, but Pat fancied she saw a slight change in Nick's expression. "Can you hear me?" repeated Hawker in louder tones. "Yes, I can hear you," came in icy tones from the figure on the couch. Pat started violently as the voice sounded. The eyes opened, and she saw in sudden terror the ruddy orbs of the demon. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 30. The Demon Free. Pat emitted a small startled shriek, and heard it echoed by a surprised grunt from Dr. Hawker. "Queer," he muttered. "The stuff must be mislabeled. Scopolamine doesn't act like this. It's a narcotic." "He's the other," gasped Pat, while the being on the couch grinned sardonically. "Eh? An attack? Can't be." The doctor shook his head emphatically. "It's not Nick," cried the girl in panic. "You're not, are you?" She appealed to the grim entity. "Not your sweetheart?" queried the creature, still with his mocking leer. "A few hours ago you were lying here all but naked, confessing you were mine. Have you forgotten?" She shuddered at the reference and shrank back in her chair. She heard the doctor's ominous angry rumble and the evil tittering chuckle of the other. "Pathological or not," snapped Hawker, "I can resent your remarks. I've considered several times varying my treatment with another solid cut to the jaw." He rose from his chair, stamping viciously toward the other. "A moment," said Nicholas Devine. "Do you know what you've done? Have you any idea what you've done?" He turned cool, mocking, red-glinting eyes on the doctor. Hawker paused as if puzzled. "What I've done? What do you mean?" "You don't know, then." The other gave a satiric smile. "You're stupid. I gave you the clue, yet you haven't the intelligence to follow it. Do you know what I am?" He leaned forward, his eyes leering evilly into the doctor's. "I'll tell you. I'm a question of synapses. That's all. Merely a question of synapses." He tittered again, horribly. "It still means nothing to you, doesn't it, doctor?" "I'll show you what it means." Hawker clenched a massive fist and strode toward the figure, whose eyes stared steadily, unwinkingly into his own. "Back!" the being snapped as the great form bent over him. The doctor paused as if struck rigid, his arm and heavy fist drawn back like the conventional fighting pose of a boxer. "Go back!" repeated the other, rising. Pat whimpered in abject terror as she heard Hawker's surprised grunt and saw him recede slowly and finally sink into his chair. His bewildered eyes were still fixed on those of Nicholas Devine. "I'll tell you what you've done," said the strange being. "You freed me. There was nothing wrong with your scopolamine. It worked," he chuckled. "You drugged him and freed me." Hawker managed a questioning grunt. "I'm free," exulted the other. "For the first time I haven't had him to fight. He's here, but helpless to oppose me. He's feeble, feeble." He gave again the horrible, tittering chuckle. "See how weak the two of you are against my unopposed powers," he jeered. "Weaklings, food for my pleasures." He turned his eyes, luminous and avid, on Pat. "This time," he said, There'll be no interruptions. A witness to our experiment will add a delicate touch of pleasure." He broke off at the doctor's sudden movement. Hawker had snatched a glistening blue revolver from his pocket, held it leveled at the lust-filled eyes. "Huh!" growled the doctor triumphantly. "Do you think I come trailing a maniac without some protection, especially a vicious one like you?" Nicholas Devine turned his eyes on his opponent. He stared long and intently. "Drop it," he commanded at length. Pat felt a surge of chaotic terror as the weapon clattered to the floor. She turned a frightened glance on Hawker's face, and her fright redoubled at the sight of his straining jaw, the perspiration-beaded forehead, and his bewildered eyes. The demon kicked the gun carelessly aside. "Puerile," he said contemptuously. He backed away from them, reseating himself on the couch whence he had risen. He surveyed the pair in sardonic mirth. "Pat," muttered the doctor huskily, "get out of here, honey. He's got some hellish trick of fascination that's paralyzed me. Get out and get help." The girl moved as if to rise. Nicholas Devine shifted his eyes for the barest instant to her face. She felt the strength drain out of her body, and she sank weakly to her chair. "It's useless," she murmured hopelessly to the doctor. He's just what I told you, a devil." "I guess you were right," mumbled Hawker dazedly. There was a burst of demonic mirth from the being on the couch. "Merely a matter of synapses," he rasped, chuckling. His face changed, took on the familiar coldness, the stony expression Pat had observed there before. "This pause," he snapped. "I've better amusement. After we've rendered your friend merely an interested onlooker." He narrowed his red eyes as if in thought. "Take off a stocking," he ordered. "Tie his hands to the back of the chair." "I won't," said the girl. The eyes shifted to her face. "I won't," she repeated tremulously as she kicked off a diminutive pump. She shuddered at the gleam in the evil eyes as she stripped the long silken sheath from a white rounded limb. She slipped a bare foot into the pump and moved reluctantly behind the chair that held the groaning Hawker. She took one of the clenched, straining hands and drew it back, fumbling with shaking fingers as she twisted the strip of thin chiffon. The demon moved closer, standing over her. "Loose knots," he snarled abruptly. He knocked her violently away with a stinging slap across her cheek, and seized the strip in his own hands. He drew the binding tight, twisting it about the lowest rung of the chair's ladder back. Hawker was forced to lean awkwardly to the rear. In this unbalanced position it was quite impossible to rise. Nicholas Devine turned away from the straining, perspiring doctor and advanced toward Pat, who cowered against the shattered cabinet. "Now," he muttered, "the experiment." He chuckled raspingly. "What delicacy of degradation! Your lover and your guardian angel, both helpless watchers. Excellent! Oh, very excellent!" He grasped her wrist, drawing her after him to the center of the room, into the full view of the horrified, staring eyes of Hawker. "Always before," continued her tormentor, "these hands have prepared you for the rites, the ceremony that failed on 2 other occasions to transpire. Would it add a poignancy to the torture if I made you strip this body of yours with your own hands, or will they suffer more watching me? Which do you think?" Pat closed her eyes in helpless resignation to her fate. "Nick," she moaned. "Oh, Nick, dearest." "Not this time," sneered the other. "Your friend and protector, the doctor, has thoughtfully eliminated your sweetheart as a factor. He struggles too feebly for me to feel." "Nick," she murmured again. "Dr. Carl." But the doctor, now pulling painfully at his bonds, could only groan in distraction and curse the unsuspected strength of sheer chiffon. He writhed miserably at the chafing of his wrists. His strange paralysis had departed, but he was quite helpless to assist Pat. "I think," said the cold tones of Nicholas Devine, that the more delicate torture lies in your willingness. Let us see." He drew her into his arms. He twisted a hand in her hair, jerked her head violently backward, and pressed avid lips to hers. She struggled a little, but hopelessly, automatically. At last she lay quite passive, quite motionless, supported by his arms, and making not the slightest response to his kiss. "Are you mine?" he queried fiercely, releasing her lips. "Are you mine now?" She shook her head without opening her eyes. "No," she said dully, "not now or ever." Again he crushed her, while the doctor looked on in helpless, bewildered, voiceless anger. This time his kiss was painful, burning, searing. Again that unholy fascination and unnatural delight in her own pain stirred her, and it took what little effort she was able to make to keep from responding. After a long interval his lips again withdrew. "Are you mine?" he repeated. She made no answer. She was gasping, and tears glistened under her closed eyelids from the pain of her crushed lips. Again he kissed her, and again the wild abandonment to evil suffused her. She was suddenly responding to his agonizing caress. She was clinging fiercely to his torturing lips, feeling an unholy exaltation in the pain of his tearing fingers in the flesh of her back. "Yours," she murmured in response to his query. She heard her voice repeat madly, "Yours, yours, yours." "Do you yield willingly?" came the icy tones of the demon. "Yes, yes, yes, willingly." "Take off your clothes," sounded the terrible, overpowering voice. He thrust her from him, so that she staggered dizzily backward. She stood swaying. The voice repeated its command. The girl's eyes widened wildly. She had the appearance of one in an ecstasy, a religious fervor. She raised her hand with a jerky, impulsive gesture to the neck of her frock, still pinned together in the makeshift repairs of the evening. Then came a strange interruption. The doctor, helpless onlooker, had at length evolved an idea out of the bewilderment in his mind. He opened his mouth and emitted a tremendous, deep, ear-shattering bellow. Nicholas Devine sent the girl spinning to the floor with a vicious shove, and turned his blazing eyes on Hawker, who was drawing in his breath for a repetition of his roar. "Quiet!" he rasped, his red orbs boring down at the other. "Quiet, or I'll muffle you!" Closing his eyes, the doctor repeated his mighty shout. The demon snatched the blanket from the couch, tossing it over the figure of the doctor, where it became a billowing, writhing heap of brown wool. He turned his gaze on Pat, who was just struggling to her feet, and moved as if to advance toward her. He paused. She had retrieved the doctor's revolver from the floor, and now faced him with the madness gone out of her eyes, supporting the weapon with both hands, the muzzle wavering towards his face. "Drop it!" he commanded. She felt a recurrence of fascination and an impulse to obey. Out of the corner of her eye she saw the doctor's head emerging from the blanket as he shook it off. "Drop it!" repeated Nicholas Devine. She closed her eyes, shutting out the vision of his dominant visage. With a surge of terror she squeezed the trigger, staggering back to the couch at the roar and the recoil. She opened her eyes. Nicholas Devine lay in the center of the room on his face. A crimson spot was matting the hair on the back of his head. She saw the doctor raise a free hand. He was working clear of his bonds. "Pat," he said softly. He looked at her pale, sickened features. "Honey," he said, "sit down till I get free. Sit down, Pat. You look faint." "Never faint," murmured the girl, and pitched backwards to the couch, with one clad and one bare leg hanging in curious limpness over the edge. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Dark Other. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Other by Stanley G. Weinbaum. Chapter 31. Not Humanly Possible. Pat opened weary eyes and gazed at a blank, uninformative ceiling. It was some moments before she realized she was lying on the couch in the room of Nicholas Devine. Somebody had placed her there, presumably, since she was quite unaware of the circumstances of her awakening. Then recollection began to form. Dr. Carl. The other. The roar of a shot. After that, nothing save a turmoil ending in blankness. A sound of movement beside her drew her attention. She turned her head and perceived Dr. Hawker kneeling over a form on the floor, fingering a white bandage about the head of the figure. Her recollections took instant form. She remembered the catastrophes of the evening. Last night, rather, since dawn glowed dully in the window. She had shot Nick. She gave a little moan and pushed herself to a sitting position. The doctor glanced at her with a sick, shaky smile. "Hello," he said. "Come to, have you? Sorry I couldn't give you any attention." He gave the bandage a final touch. "Here's a job I had no heart for," he muttered. "Better for everyone to let things happen without interference." The girl, returning to full awareness, noticed now that the bandage consisted of strips of the doctor's shirt. She glanced fearfully at the still features of Nicholas Devine. She saw pale cheeks and closed eyes, but indubitably not the grim mien of the demon. "Dr. Carl," she whispered, he isn't... "Not yet. But will he? I don't know. That's a bad spot, a wound at the base of the brain. You'd best know it now, Pat, but also realize that nothing can happen to you. I'll see to that." "To me?" she said dully. "What difference does that make? It's Nick I want saved." "I'll do my best for you, honey," said Hawker with almost a hint of reluctance. "I phoned Briggs General for an ambulance. Your faint lasted a full quarter hour," he added. "What can we tell them?" asked the girl. "What can we say?" "Don't you say anything, Pat. I'm not on the board for nothing." He rose from his knees, glancing out of the window into the cool dawn. "Queer neighborhood," he said. "All that yelling and a shot, and still no sign of interest from the neighbors. That's Chicago, though," he mused. "Lucky for us, Pat, we can handle the thing quietly now." But the girl was staring dully at the still figure on the floor. "Oh, God," she said huskily. "Help him, Dr. Carl." "I'll do my best," responded Hawker gloomily. "I was a good surgeon before I specialized in psychiatry. Brain surgery, too. It led right into my present field." Pat said nothing, but dropped her head on her hands and stared vacantly before her. "Better for you and for him, too, if I fail," muttered the doctor. His words brought a reply. "You won't fail," she said tensely. "You won't." "Not voluntarily, I'm afraid," he growled morosely. "I've still a little respect for medical ethics, but if ever a case—" His voice trailed into silence as from somewhere in the dawn sounded the wail of a siren. "There's the ambulance," he finished. Pat sat unmoving as the sounds from outdoors detailed the stopping of the vehicle before the house. She heard the doctor descending the steps and the creak of the door. Though it took place before her eyes, she scarcely saw the white-coated youths as they lifted the form of Nicholas Devine and bore it from the room on a stretcher, treading with carefully broken steps to prevent the swaying of the support. Dr. Hawker's order to follow made no impression on her. She sat dully on the couch as the chamber emptied. Why, she wondered, had the thought of Nick's death disturbed her so? Wasn't it but a short time since they had both contemplated it? What had occurred to alter that determination? Nick was dying, she thought mournfully. All that remained was for her to follow. There on the floor lay the revolver, and on the table, glistening in the wan light, reposed the untouched lethal draught. That was the preferable way, she mused, staring fixedly at its glowing contour. But suppose Nick weren't to die? She'd have abandoned him to his terrible doom, left him to face a situation far more ominous than any unknown terrors beyond death. She shook her head distractedly, and looked up to meet the eyes of Dr. Hawker, who was watching her gravely in the doorway. "Come on, Pat," he said gently. She rose, followed him down the stairs and out into the morning light. The driver of the ambulance stared curiously at her dishevelled, bedraggled figure, but she was so weary and forlorn that even the effort of brushing away the black strands of hair that clouded her smoke-dark eyes was beyond her. She slumped into the seat of the doctor's car and sighed in utter exhaustion. "Rush it!" Hawker called to the driver ahead. "I'll follow you." The car swept into motion, and the swift cool morning air beating against her face from the open window restored some clarity to her mind. She fixed her eyes on the rear of the speeding vehicle they followed. "Is there any hope at all?" she queried despondently. "I don't know, Pat. I can't tell yet. When you closed your eyes he had half turned, dodged, and the bullet entered his skull near the base, near the cerebellum. If it had pierced the cerebellum, his heart and breathing must have stopped instantly. They didn't, however, and that's a mildly hopeful sign. Very mildly hopeful, though. Do you know now what what the attack was?" "No, Pat," Hawker admitted, "I don't." "Call it a devil if you like. I can't name it any better." His voice changed to a tone of wonder. "Pat, I can't understand that paralyzing fascination the thing exerted. Any medical man would say that mental dominance of that sort doesn't exist." "Hypnotism?" the girl suggested. "Bah! Every psychiatrist uses hypnotism in his business. It's part of some treatments. There's nothing of fascination about it. No dominance of one will over another, despite the popular view. That's natural and understandable. This was like the exploded claims of mesmerism. I tell you, it's not humanly possible, and yet I felt it." "Not humanly possible," murmured Pat. "That's the answer, then, Dr. Carl. Maybe now you'll believe in my devil." "I'm tempted to." "You'll have to. Can't you see it, Dr. Carl? Even his name, Nick, that's a colloquialism for the devil, isn't it?" "And divine, I suppose," said Hawker. "Refers to his angelic ancestry. Devils are only fallen angels, aren't they?" "All right," said Pat wearily. "Make fun of it. You'll see." "I'm not making fun of your theory, honey. I can't offer a better one myself. I never saw nor heard of anything similar, and I'm not in position to ridicule any theory." "But you don't believe me." "Of course I don't, Pat. You're weaving an intricate fairy tale about a pathological condition and a fortuitous suggestiveness in names. Whatever the condition is, and I confess I don't understand it, it's something rational, and those things can be treated." "Treated by exorcism," said the girl. "That's the only way anyone ever succeeded in casting out a devil." The doctor made no answer. The wailing vehicle ahead of them swung rapidly out of sight into an alley, and Hawker halted his car before the grey facade of Briggs General. "Come in here," he said, helping Pat to alight. "You'll want to wait, won't you?" "How long," she queried listlessly, before you'll know?" "Perhaps immediately. The only chance is to get that bullet out at once, if there's still time for it." She followed him into the building, past a desk where a white-clad girl regarded her curiously, and up an elevator. He led her into a small office. "Sit here," he said gently, and disappeared. She sat dully in the chair he had indicated, and minutes passed. She made no attempt to think. The long cataclysmic night had exhausted her powers. She simply sat and suffered. The deep scratches of fingernails burned in the flesh of her back. Her cheek pained from the violent slap, and her head and jaw ached from that first blow, the one that had knocked her unconscious last evening. But these twinges were minor. They were merely physical, and the hurts of the demon had struck far deeper than any physical injury. The damage to her spirit was by all odds the more painful. It numbed her mind and dulled her thoughts, and she simply sat idle and stared at the blank wall. She had no conception of the interval before Dr. Hawker returned. He entered quietly and began rinsing his hands at a basin in the corner. "Is it over?" she asked listlessly. "Not even begun," he responded. "However, it isn't too late. He'll be ready in a moment or so." "I wish it were over," she murmured, "one way or the other." "I, too," said the doctor. "With all my heart I wish it were over. If there were anyone within call who could handle it, I'd turn it to him gladly, but there isn't." He moved again toward the door, leaning out and glancing down the hall. "You stay here," he admonished her. "Don't try to find us. I want no interruptions, no matter what enters that mind of yours." "You needn't worry," she said soberly. "I'm not fool enough for that." She leaned wearily back in the chair, closing her eyes. A long interval passed. She was vaguely surprised to see the doctor still standing in the doorway when she opened her eyes. She had fancied him already in the midst of his labor. "What will you do?" she asked. "About what?" "I mean, what sort of operation will it need? Probing or what?" "Oh," he said, "I'll have to trephine him. Must get that bullet." "What's that, trephine?" He glanced down the hall. "They're ready," he said, and turned to go. At the door he paused. "Trephining is to open a little door in the skull. If your devil is in his head, we'll have it out along with the bullet." His footsteps receded down the hall. End of chapter 31.